an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we go. Look at that. As we record it, it is the ultimate day of February 2024. Good of you to join us and getting used to this new rhythm for now and next. It's Story Studio Network's flagship podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. Welcome in. In case you're just joining us, wondering where have you been the rest of the week? We've decided to go weekly with Now and Next. Roughly the same amount of content, though, so it's just a matter of being able to manage it all from production, and we'll talk about some of the other productions we've got going on at SSN. But, yeah, it's keeping us busy. And we're going to embark on some experiential podcasting next week in Toronto. We're heading to PDAC. It's the Prospectors and Development Association of Canada. Mining, basically. Big conference. And we're going to be doing some podcasting on the floor of the convention. So looking forward to that. And some of that content will land here in the coming weeks. So, yeah, some pretty cool stuff going on. As far as natural resources, the environment, all that stuff. So, wait for that. In this episode, we are going to talk about the developments in Ottawa around the Canada Disability Benefit. The feds have put the law in place. The regulation framework is there. One small thing missing. The money. How much will they fund the Canada Disability Benefit? Kind of important, so we'll get to that. Otherwise, it's just meaningless words on paper. Also, question for you. You got kids in the house? How much do they know about money? How financially literate are they? Maybe how financially literate are you? It's a good question. We focus on STEM all the time. I like to call it STEAM because I insist we throw the arts into science, tech, engineering, and math. But where is that financial literacy? Where does that fall? Yeah, going to get to that too. And here we are, year 3 into Russia's war in Ukraine. We're going to get some expertise on that strategically from a guy who used to sit in the chair as one of the operational directors at NORAD. So, plenty there, plenty to talk about, and we'll get to that. But as I mentioned off the top, it is Leap Day. 365.25 days a year means that, every 4 years we add another day to the calendar. Well, a couple things. We've got all the different months, different numbers. Here's the question I have for you. What do you think about the idea if we added a month to the year, 13 months a year, 28 days in each month? So just keep that simple. No having to remember 30 days in September, April, June, and November. All the rest of 31, except for February. Well, carry on. We can get rid of that rhyme. And that means, though, still, we'd have a leap year, but it wouldn't happen for every 10 years. Now, imagine having that birthday. And can I just say right now, if we're going to add a day to the calendar, can't we do it in the summer when the weather's nice, at least? Right now, as I speak, it is sunny and snowing in Toronto. A little weird. Yeah, I know. It's all that and more. All right, let's get to it. We want to check out the story around what is the federal government prepared to do in its upcoming budget. Will it or will it not be funding the Canada Disability Benefit? Now, those of you who have been paying close and careful attention, you will know that I have spent a good deal of time working on the 2030 Project podcast series. And the most recent offering there in terms of the series was 6 or 8 parts that we did dealing specifically with the Canada Disability Benefit. And it was an interesting approach in terms of the podcast because I think it was the first time we at Story Studio Network had done a series that was pointedly targeting more of an advocacy voice around shift of policy or making the point around government policy. And in this case, it was the framework that was the Canada Disability Benefit. That arrived legislatively at the end of June last year. Here we are into budget season, and while it's all been great, and we had the minister on who was responsible for the bill itself, making commitments that this was going to move forward, and that's great to hear. Here we are, we're into budget season, and very close to the federal budget, and this means next to nothing unless the feds put money where their mouth is. So the question is, where are we on that path? We're weeks away from seeing that. Neil Hetherington is the CEO at Daily Bread, and I know you were in Ottawa, I guess, last week to bang the drum for the benefit. We heard all the right things through the course of that, and I was really actually quite impressed with the minister when she joined us on the show, talk about what she saw as the need, what her commitments were. But admittedly, she realized that there are some challenges. But I thought, okay, at least it's on the right desk. I had that feeling coming away from that interview. Now, that was about 3 or 4 months ago. Here we are. We're ready for, as I said, bracing for the federal budget. What's your read of the playing field right now?
Well, I'm going to remain ever hopeful, but realistically, every indication that we're getting is that the 1 million Canadians who would benefit from a fully funded Canada Disability Benefit will not be able to thrive in community from an income that gets them to the poverty line. It looks like the government is saying, wait a second, we now need to be fiscally responsible to a degree that is detrimental to the most vulnerable in our country. So they're talking about funding of sort of $1 or $2 billion. That's what we hear. And so to put that in context, a good rule of thumb would be for every $1 billion that they put towards the benefit, it'll mean $100 in the pocket of somebody who is on a disability plan per month. So every billion equals 100. And so you need to get about 10 to 12 billion. People need about $1,000 more than what they're currently getting. So if you are on disability in Ontario, you're getting $1,300 a month. The poverty line is $2,300 a month. And so our hope is that it gets to the $1,000 or so dollars a month, which is still inadequate, but at least gets to a certain level of being able to hopefully not rely on food banks. And we're not getting the indications, the warm and fuzzies of being able to get a fully funded Canada Disability Benefit are not there right now. So we're going to do everything we can right now to make it incredibly painful for every politician who is not fully funding the benefit. And they still have opportunity to walk back from the ledge that they're on. Well,
they do, except, what made the headlines this week as we speak is the deal, for a national pharmacare plan, where the focus, and I do not begrudge, the idea behind the plan. I think that makes sense in many respects. But it's a fairly limited package in terms of what they're offering. We're already hearing that provinces are up in arms about exactly how they would roll that plan out, because they say that the feds are cutting our grass, particularly in Alberta, for example. Mm-hmm. So I can see where there are landmines all over the place politically on national programs like this. So to say that you're getting any money, I guess, is optimistic. And I say I mean any money going into the plan, to the benefit. But at the same time, this is just fraught with political, jurisdictional pissing contests.
Well, you brought up Alberta, and here's the benefit of the Canada Disability Benefit. It's targeted. It's not a universal program. It's a targeted intervention to an individual that really needs it, and so it plays very well among all parties. I mean, every party agreed that this is something that we need to do, and so I'm hopeful that they will look at that advantage and say this is an opportunity to bring together folks of various political stripes and fully fund it.
So that's the line from the government of the day, the Liberal government. Where is the NDP on this? Because if they can make pharmacare a priority and we can make housing a priority, surely the NDP should be flexing their political muscle and saying we need to make poverty a priority.
I got to say, they're not. They're not making a priority. I would love for an NDPer to listen to this podcast and phone me up and say, no, you got it all wrong, and we're fully here to fully back the Canada Disability Benefit. But they're not there. Their priorities lie with the ones that you just talked about, those universal programs, universal dental, universal pharmacare. But as you said, it's not really universal pharmacare. It's universal limited pharmacare, and so our hope is that they will get behind this and say who suffers most when it comes to, as a proportion, as a population, as a community. Who do we legislate to be in poverty? The reality is, it's those that are on disability benefits. And so they have the opportunity to lift them up and out of that. And so this is the time for them to show leadership and to make that happen.
Based on the polling that we're seeing, and I realize it's a snapshot and it's a rearview mirror, blah, 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 I get it. But there's a certain trend in terms of, the way things are going in terms of the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP. It would seem that even among, I think the latest polling I saw, I don't know if it was Nanos or Abacus, suggesting that the younger demographic is more likely to vote NDP than they are to vote Liberal, and they're certainly more likely to vote Conservative than they are to vote either NDP or Liberal. It suggests to me that both the NDP and the Liberal song is getting tired. People aren't enough. We're just not getting anywhere further ahead. And what's behind that is the sense, overwhelmingly, I think, that generally there is a malaise, there is a fatigue. I may not be living in poverty, but boy, am I facing a hard time putting food on the table, just generally. My job may well be at risk. My hours at work are at risk. Again, I may not be one of your clients at the food bank, but I'm feeling the economic pinch here. And that seems to be resonating with a huge portion of the population, and that's what's likely to drive a change in government. So, what are the prospects with Prime Minister Poilievre saying, okay, Neil, no, not to worry, we're in a place where we're going to actually look at this and fully fund and make this a robust program?
Well, I mean, the poll Abacus today was 41% to 24% for the Conservatives over the Liberals. I mean, that's a substantive lead that they have. If that is the case, I think that the idea that they are targeting individuals is sort of in their lane, and so a fully funded Canada Disability Benefit might happen there. I think that they are seizing the day when it comes to the malaise that you talked about. They are blaming everything on 8 years of Justin Trudeau. The phrase, just everything is too costly, is sticking. People are it's sticking around cut the carbon tax, and people are looking at how do we make things more affordable. And so, leaders, I think, generally need to leave on a high. And so there is a tiredness out there right now, and very few leaders will say in that it's time for me to. You look down to our friends in the States. Should Biden have said early on, I'm going to be a one-termer. I think he would be doing very, very well because he's got a lot of legislative wins. And so, we always look for change. And we are advocating for change, not change in government, but certainly change in policy. And so whether it is a Poilievre government or a Trudeau government or a Singh government, we will be knocking on their door both this March and the following March to say the 1 million Canadians that need the Canada Disability Benefit need it now. And so, but all of that said, we've kind of gone down a dark road here, Dave. The budget's not out. And so I think we need to say, okay, well, now's the time to mobilize. Now is the time to make sure that every single Canadian is sending a note to Christian Freeland and saying, you've got to fund this. And so we've created fundthebenefit.ca. There's been about 65,000 letters sent to her. So it's getting to the point where it is material, where they're starting to notice it at her constituency office, where they're saying, we do need to do something about that. We've been in every Liberal, actually every member of Parliament's office who have accepted our invitation to talk about the benefit and and why it is so good for Canada and Canadians. And so we're hopeful that the populace as a whole will advocate hard.
Fundthebenefit.ca. And so when I go to that site, if I activate the site, am I sending something directly, or do I customize something that I'm sending to an MP, or do I direct it to specifically to somebody in my ward? How does that work?
It works as the way you want it to work. So you will get a note out right away to both your local MP as well as the Deputy Prime Minister. You can customize the letter. You can have that letter sent in a matter of 20, 30 seconds. Fundthebenefit.ca. It's very slick. It's very straightforward. And together with our coalition of partners across the country, within the disability communities, we are trying very hard to raise voices. And as I said, to make it very painful for somebody who makes the decision not to fully fund it. All
right. Well, we'll catch up with you on budget day. I'm guessing there'll be a lot of phone calls from media saying, so what do you think? But we'll try and work our way into your schedule around budget day.
Thanks very much, Dave. Thanks for talking about this, and thanks to everybody listening who might go to the website and make sure that folks know that this is an important piece of legislation.
Fundthebenefit.ca. If you want background on this, just go and check out the 2030 Project podcast. There's all kinds of content there. It explains, I think, fairly robustly where we are with just generally poverty in this country, and it takes us into the need and the framework of the Canada Disability Benefit. So, and that is the 2030 Project. Wherever you're listening to the podcast, probably right here. Neil Hetherington is the CEO at the Daily Bread Food Bank in Toronto. Noted yesterday on the social media, there are wildfires. I mentioned this last week about the zombie fires kind of still burning in Western Canada. The wildfires in Texas, in the Panhandle, right now have already hit a record. The fire that they're dealing with is the second largest wildfire in the history of Texas. Did I mention it's still February? It's winter.
Unusual weather we're having, ain't it?
Crazy swing in temperatures in that part of the world. They went from 80 degrees Fahrenheit on Monday of this week, dropped down to around the freezing mark with an Arctic blast that moved into the region. And now they're back headed towards the mid-70s by next week, all in about 2.5 weeks' time. This huge swing. So it's dry for sure, and that's leading to the problem with the fires. But as I said, it's still winter. What the hell is going to happen when the real heat of the summer months hit? Just saying. We do a little bit of work with the forestry folks, and we've talked a lot about the wildfires and the forest fires and the carbon emissions that result because of the fires. So I would encourage you to check out Canadian Forestry Can Save the World.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Lots of noise this week about going to Mars. We had the the moon landing last week. Bit of a what? Wasn't real, man. That was a dud. Right? It fell over when it arrived, and they lost contact with it. Such is the state of space exploration right now. But our next guest is actually an individual who was selected as a possible traveler to Mars. But that's not why we're talking to her. Although it might be, because the name of her book is The Wealthy Martian. And it's all about you, your kids, and financial literacy. Well, if you're of an age, you will have recognized this. Something in the back of your head's going, what the hell is that? That is the theme from My Favorite Martian, and I had to dig it up because it landed in my inbox over the holidays, over Christmas. A new book that's come out that focuses on financial literacy, particularly for the younger folk in our life. But I was intrigued by the title. It's called The Wealthy Martian, written by Karen Cumming. I won't say you're an old colleague. I'll say you're a longtime colleague, because we're getting to that point where people get kind of, what do you mean I'm old?
I wouldn't be insulted by that at all, Dave. We are kind of aging, aren't we?
Well, and it is funny how in your book you've kind of imparted some of that wisdom that comes with that process. I have long said that, you know, when I look at the education system, my friend Tony Chapman and I worked on a couple of shows together, and we would talk about the education of our kids and how are we going to engage them. And Tony's view was, you know, why aren't we gamifying, for example, our education more? There seems to be more problem solving in the video games that they play, etc. And a lot of that comes down to the point I think that you're making in your book. Problem solving is, you know, at the root of money, and financial stability is problem solving, right? And so I think there's a whole lot of new lens that we need to bring to this. So, and I'm going to ask you the question that you posed, or you actually anticipated in the preface for your book. I know you as a longtime journalist. I know you were a teacher. But what brings you to the point where you think that you've got something to impart on those, you know, again, whether it's high school or university age kids who are able to say, you know, you need to be paying attention to financial literacy?
Well, I think it's the nature of being a journalist, and you can relate to this. If you put a journalist inside a bureaucracy, a journalist is constantly questioning authority and saying, why do we do it this way? Why couldn't we try this? I noticed this is missing. You know, why isn't there a better way or a different way? It's just who you are. And in some cases, it can be painful to be that person inside a system like that. But at the end of the day, I think that it serves a purpose, because it forces, I'll speak for myself, it forced me to really sit down and take a look at what wasn't happening in the school system. And I can say this, I mean, I've been guilty of painting with a broad brush and saying there's no financial literacy education at all in the school system. It's a terrible thing and we have to do something. But since that time, I have done a bit of a deeper dive into some of the curriculum that's available online. You can look at it. They have made small steps towards introducing little pieces of financial literacy in other subjects, in a wide range of subjects. But to me, it's dicing it way too fine. What's missing is personal financial literacy education in a very real and meaningful way. And the reason why this has become so meaningful to me is that within the last year and a half or so, I retired from my teaching job. And when you make that choice, that's when you decide to finally pull the trigger, that's a pretty daunting experience. And when you get on the other side of it, you realize all the things you could have done to make it better, to make it easier for yourself, to make sure that you might have had more money. And I would say that at the end of the day, I looked at the system that I was a part of, and I said to myself, the system is not teaching middle class people how to make their money work for them. It's teaching them how to work for their money. And we need to start doing this differently. That's all there is to it.
And I find that when you do talk to people about it, at whatever age, it's not as, I think the problem they have is they think that it's scary. They're not going to understand this. Even for a guy like me who doesn't understand math all that well, I'm able to grasp, okay, I get it. I understand where all of this sort of fits in place. So it's not about being a mathematician. The emphasis is on literacy.
Exactly. I mean, if there can be a focus on English literacy in our school system, why on earth wouldn't there be a focus on financial literacy? I mean, if I had kids, for me, it would be one of the most important things I would ever want my children to be learning in school. Literally the basics that I throw out in the first part of the book here, they're so simple, but if no one ever teaches you these things, you never put them into practice. So, for example, live beneath your means. What does that mean to do that? Why is it important? How does it help you to actually hang on to money in order to be able to spend it on things that are meaningful to you later in your life? If maybe you make your own coffee at home instead of going to Starbucks every day. If no one teaches you that, how can you put it into practice and make it a habit? Pay yourself first. Such a simple concept that the wealthy barber talked about 30 years ago when I first read that book. But how often do you hear anyone in the school system talking about how important that is? Writing down your goals. Such a simple thing, but I never had anyone in school teach me to do that as part of making sure that I could look after myself financially. Build a budget. People are afraid of building a budget. They think it's nerdy. They don't realize that it's really the foundation of everything. Getting off a debt go-round. I mean, picture a merry-go-round in your head, only it's debt instead of horses. We're all on it because we live in a society that encourages rampant consumerism. If nobody ever teaches us to get out of debt, we're going to wind up in debt when we're retired, and that's not a good thing. The concept of insurance. Buy it when you're young because the premiums are so much lower. If I had understood that, I wouldn't be paying $234 a month for a critical illness insurance policy because I only took it out when I was 55. I mean, these are really important things to understand. And finally, I call these the wealthy Martian 7. Number 7 is writing a will. People are daunted by this. They don't want to confront their own mortality, and I understand. But writing a will is one of the most important things we could ever talk about in school, because if we don't have a will, guess who decides what happens to our money and our possessions? The government. Nobody wants that, but nobody ever taught that to me in school. And I really believe that it's time that we start doing things very, very differently to prepare our children for what has become a very I'm going to say, should I use the word scary? It's a bit of a scary world out there, and we need to be ready for it.
Well, and so let me just put that up front because that's where I was going to go with the next question. This sounds scary. It sounds like a lot of work. It sounds easy to ignore. So I'm just going to back burner this, and sorry, Karen, I'm not going to bother.
But you know what, Dave? Look at the stuff we do teach kids in school. Calculus, how to write an English essay, how to build a Muskoka chair in shop class, how to research a science project. All of those things are daunting. If we're going to teach them daunting things, why don't we teach them something daunting that's actually going to be practical and productive for them in their real life? That would be what I would say to that.
The only thing I would add to what you're talking about, and I'm not arguing with you in that respect. I mean, the interesting thing in my life is that I probably learned more about financial literacy from my kids than I did from mom and dad. And I learned a lot from mom and dad because, that was an important part of managing the house. But the other thing that I've learned, again, in terms of the work that I do now, coming out of a newsroom, coming out of a relatively stable work environment, to being self-employed, to being a freelancer, to running your own company, to being a partner in a company, to having people work for you in that company, is learning how to be an entrepreneur. So I would say that the next, course in this program, financial literacy and entrepreneurship, and there needs to be there's a spirit that attaches both of them, wherein there is cause and effect. Failure is not seen to be something we should be afraid of. I've made a lot of mistakes since I sort of stepped off the bridge and decided, where's the parachute here? How am I going to manage this? But here I am these many years later, and we're good. And I never knew how or learned how or was taught how to be an entrepreneur. But that's part of what you're talking about. And I think that's a critical thing that's missing in terms of igniting that spirit in kids when they're young, to be adventurous in science, to be adventurous in their whatever it is, their craft, their art, all of those things, where we hear parents say, well, why do you want to learn philosophy? Because there's something adventurous about it. And if we can bring that entrepreneurial spirit, it doesn't mean they have to run their own business, but I think it kind of gets at the underlying motivation behind what you're talking about.
Absolutely. What comes to my mind when you talk about that is Robert Kiyosaki and Rich Dad Poor Dad. If anyone who's listening has not read that book, his story is that his poor dad was his biological dad, who was a university professor who made good money but seemed to have a challenging time hanging on to very much of it because he didn't have perhaps the financial habits in place that would have served him well. His rich dad was his friend Mike's dad, who was not a highly educated man, but became a business person and surrounded himself with smart people who helped him run successive businesses. And the rich dad was the man who helped Robert Kiyosaki learn some of the principles of financial literacy. And I recall reading in the book, he talks about this idea that people who run their own businesses have to be financially literate. If you're not going to have a business for very long. You have to understand money, not only how to make it, but how to invest it so that it makes more money. So I think there's a lot of value in what you're talking about. There actually is some move toward entrepreneurship classes in schools. But again, I would say it's not nearly enough of a focus on it. It's not as widespread as it needs to be. It really should be front and center instead of an also ran.
Well, I would suggest to you that it's not even about money management. It makes you a better employee in that bigger system. It makes you a better teacher. It makes you a better engineer or a lawyer or a doctor, a nurse, or the maintenance worker who's taking care of the furnace in the hospital.
Sure.
I think it kind of implants and imparts a certain lens that you bring to your approach, not just to work, but to relationships, to life. Your retirement. I mean,
yes.
You are now, in your retirement, you're effectively an entrepreneur. You're kind of finding your own way.
That's right.
In terms of, you're on the fixed income. But I know you and many others who are in the retirement now, the part of that is, I'm still working. I'm still doing other things. I'm still making income. So how do you manage that? It's a completely different treadmill that you're on.
And it is, and I find that it's a treadmill that no one prepares you for.
Yeah,
suddenly
yeah.
You wake up one morning and you say to yourself, well, what next? And how do I do it? And I agree with you.
So before we go, I don't want to leave the Martian part hanging. So give me the... Explain to our audience where the Martian piece comes into this
Well,
story.
I am one of what's known as the Mars 100. 100 people from around the world who made it to the final round of astronaut selection in a legitimate mission to colonize Mars that started around 2013 when a Dutch businessman named Bas Lansdorp decided that he wanted to make his childhood dream come true, and that was to take humankind to Mars. So he partnered with a man named Arno Wielders, who worked for the European Space Agency, and they came up with a concept of encouraging citizen astronauts to apply for a legit mission to Mars. And for the longest time, I believed with all my heart that I was going to Mars. And what happens when you're in that situation is you start looking at the world around you, at this earth, and you ask yourself, what do we do well here and what could we do better? And, the list of things we do well is so long. I mean, so many wonderful things that earthlings do well. But I looked around me and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that there was one thing that we did not do so well, and that was to teach young people about financial literacy. And it just so happens that a couple of years ago in the middle of the pandemic, I was listening to a presentation online, a man who was presenting to a group that I belong to, and his name was Derek Foster. And Derek Foster retired at 34 because he understood the power of dividends at the age of 18, and he started investing in blue chip stock using something called a dividend reinvestment plan, or a DRIP. I had never heard of this concept in my life before, and I read several of his books. I spoke to him personally, and I said to him, Derek, if middle-class people understood what this is and how to wrap their heads around it and how to do it for themselves, it could really change the trajectory of their lives, couldn't it? And he said yes. And when I heard him say yes, I knew that I had to first of all, do it for myself. I set up drip accounts for myself to learn how to do it. And I wanted to explain to other people how to do it as well. So that was really the impetus for writing the book. But I also understood that around that, it was also necessary to talk about concepts around personal finance for young people and for all of us, whether we're young or we're semi-retired. We're all just trying to figure it out. And I think the more help we can get, the better. And that's what I hope this book will be for people.
All right. Got to finish this off because I know you had mentioned Lost in Space, one of your favorites when you were a kid.
Yes, Danger, Will Robinson.
Indeed. Nothing like the original. Karen, thanks for joining us, and good luck with the book.
Thank you, Dave. It was great to talk with you.
Yeah, good to connect with Karen. She's a former broadcast journalist. We crossed paths when we both worked in Hamilton. We both worked together in Toronto. She's a retired teacher. She is an author, as we pointed out, of The Wealthy Martian, but also wrote an interesting book on the indispensable survival guide to Ontario's long-term care system. And it's almost a first-hand account of how she and her sister had to cope with all the challenges of navigating long-term care. And it happened in and around the time we headed into COVID. So some interesting perspectives there. I want to check out what she has to offer. Her website is karencumming.com. All right, as mentioned, here we are. This is the first week of the third year of the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine. Where do we stand on that politically, militarily, and what's ahead for us? Because I know it's in the headlines all the time, but I bet it's not coming up in common conversation these days. But there's a real threat here that we really do need to be paying attention to. Scott Clancy joins us. He is a retired Major General with the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly with the Royal Canadian Air Force. And thanks for doing this. We managed to cross paths, I think, at the launch of the Pathway to the Stars book by the RCAF Foundation. And we'll get into it on another day, but the storied history of the RCAF is just extraordinary.
It sure is. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, it was very nice to catch up with you at that event. Yeah,
and they're doing good work at the foundation, small but mighty team. So with all of the work they do with scholarships and the fascinating history of of Canadian aviation sort of stored up in that storybook. But the reason you're here, a couple of things I want to talk to you about. Here we are. We are now into year 3 of the war in Ukraine. Did you imagine we'd ever get to this point?
Yes, absolutely. To me, now perhaps not at the onset of the invasion, but once the initial penetration towards Kyiv and the surrounding of Kyiv was pushed back and the lines started to establish themselves, yeah, I had a real good sense that this was going to be a long-term effort and not just something that was going to be over the way that Western populations like to think that conflict is over. Just send in the armored forces and away they go. Mm-hmm. I thought that this was going to be a long-term thing.
And it's interesting, and again, I am no military historian. I'm simply an observer on the sidelines looking at this stuff. But it would appear to me that the conflicts in the last 50, 60 years post World War II have actually lingered a whole lot longer than we would have expected here on the home front, for example. When we look at, and in some ways we look at the Great Wars and say, they were very difficult and they took a lot out of our population, they took a lot out of our economy, all these sorts of things. But relatively speaking, they didn't last nearly as long as what we're potentially even talking about in Ukraine when we look at what happened in Afghanistan, et cetera. Do you have any insight into what we're looking at there?
Well, I think that the post-Cold War era is protracted conflict. Protracted conflict in that you're not really dealing with the conventional conflict like you're seeing necessarily in Ukraine, armored forces against armored forces. You're not seeing the great powers have at it with enormous losses, or you're seeing a very small adversary being overrun by a very large coalition, usually backed by the United States. I think that this is the kind of character that you see in the post-Cold War era. I will caution, though, if the bottom line is just duration, the 100 Years' War, like we can go back in history and look at protracted conflicts. But I think with distance from especially World War I and World War II, we start to forget the absolute cost, in terms of numbers and decimation of countries, let alone their economies, that those, short, but I say short, relatively short, 5 years. And remember that in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and all of the conflicts, we're sending people over and they might do a 6-month tour or something. People left in 1939, 1940, and didn't come back till 1945, if at all. Like, that was, you went to war, you came back 5 or 6 years later. I think we lose the impact that those kind of things had on our societies.
There's also an emotional connection that we actually attach to those memories, and needless to say, we just need to go to a cenotaph on Remembrance Day and know that those who have a direct connection with any of those conflicts, the world wars, there aren't many of them anymore. So we rely on the history, we rely on the retelling, we rely on the film and the books being written about it. And I wonder whether or not some of that colors our perspective, for example, what goes on in Ukraine, because we think of this as being a European war. Surely it must be solvable in a short period, again, point out a relatively shorter period of time. And we make that comparison to the Second World War.
And I also think that we forget our own history. We think that World War II was a European war. And we forget that shells fell on Canadian soil, that ships were downed right outside of the Halifax harbor, that German submarines came right up the St. Lawrence, that, St. John's, Newfoundland harbor was attacked with shells from, German U-boats, and that the Battle of the Atlantic took place right at our doorstep. I think that it's almost like we jade ourselves into thinking that Canada's isolation, geography speaking, and our huge southern ally can lull us into, these are not global wars. We can carry on with our beautiful lives. Now, the great values and way in which Canadian society has set itself up are fantastic, but they have to be protected. And I think we get lulled into a false sense of security. As the director of operations for NORAD, I'll tell you, anything that Russia does, whether it's in Asia or in Europe, Ukraine, directly affects how its operations are conducted worldwide, especially to Canada.
So give me that point of view in terms of, what's going on militarily in terms of the conversation against the backdrop of what's going on around the conversation around defense policy, and then the conversation around the politics of war. There's three very different and difficult, circles there to sort of jam into a Venn diagram.
So for sure. So let's start at the military level. The conflict in Ukraine has proven a lot of things, and you can draw lots of lessons learned at a military level. It's a proving ground for things like the use of very small teams, hyper digitized, the use of cyber and jamming, electronic warfare, very small drones that can have huge effects against very conventional, solid armed forces. It's shown what we thought in the West was always a problem with respect to the Russian doctrine surrounding war, which is, as I've said, heavily armored forces can defeat anything, scorched earth, and. The other thing that I think is coming back to roost, and those of us in the military spheres who teach and understand tactics, it's one thing to stop someone from a defensive point of view. Even the numbers that are required to hold a force at bay can be significantly smaller. A very small number of troops can hold off a very large number of people in the offense. You don't have to go any further than, the Spartans at the wall in the famous movie of the 300 to know that in the defense, a very small force using geography can do that. But it takes a much larger force to dislodge. So in the offense, the Ukrainians are trying to push back the Russians. The Russians are in these layered defensive systems using a lot of weaponry that we would never use in the West, mines and things like this, that it's going to take hundreds, if not thousands of troops. And when I say cost, the cost dead to be able to kick the Russians back out. So at the military level, that's a real problem. Now, I would say that the bridge between that military, all of those military tactics and the next level up, that defense policy, and even to strategy, is what goals do you set for yourself? So in Ukraine, President Zelensky's been pretty clear. He wants the pre-2014 borders to be reestablished. He says pre-2011, but it's really the assault on Crimea and then their invasion in Donetsk and Luhansk that's the problem. Crimea is going to be a red line. Like, we all in the West, everybody knows this. So it's like the unspoken truth, which is NATO would really love if the Russians said, listen, we're going to go back to keeping Crimea. We'll get out of the rest of the stuff and we'll have a nice day. We high five and we're carrying on with the rest of the world order. But I don't think that's where the Russians are going to be. They're going to try to entrench themselves. And I don't think that's where President Zelensky is. That means that this protracted conflict, like so far, it's just going to protect itself even further. So from a defense policy point of view, here's Canada trying to say, well, how do we play into this sphere? I think you start to bridge out of just a conflict in Europe into global conflict. And this is the advent, when we finished the Cold War and Russia went into a period of decline, we've seen their military capability ramp up significantly. China has been doing the same thing. And what you're seeing especially in the academic literature, is a return to great power competition. When I say great power competition, there was a single superpower for a very long period of time, very long, last 20 years. And now we're seeing the return of at least three powers. Now, China's on the rise. Russia's pretty much on the decline, especially demographically and economically. But they've got a significant problem there. So for Canada, that means you really have to contribute to NATO. You have to play in that sphere. You have to be able to deploy forces to NATO. But for a very small country, and this is where I think Canada's actually recently been able to, pick up one tool that they haven't picked up in our history so far, which is NORAD, and say that NORAD is actually NATO. And this is a problem for us in North America and the Europeans. The Europeans constantly look through the paradigm of NATO and a war with Russia, which means that North America is coming to their aid. The reality is, again, opinion, the soft underbelly of NATO and the West is not Europe. It's not even American forces deploying to Europe. It's North America. And if Russia was really going to come after the Americans, they'd come after them here. They'd come after them on our soil. So when we're defending the skies, when we're defending the continent of North America, the securing the maritime approaches, making sure that Arctic security and sovereignty is taken care of, you're actually doing NATO's work as well. What's unfathomable, however, is thinking, so if the Russians would attack North America as opposed to Europe, could you see German forces deploying to American soil or Canadian soil? And the answer is no, they never would. Well, hold on for a second. Then why are we in Latvia? Then why are Canadian forces? So that whole defense policy thing you have to start to rethink. And then once you start getting outside of that just European war, we have to think about the Indo-Pacific region and the advent of China and the way in which it is rising on the global sphere. So it's a regional power now, but it's moving itself very quickly to being a global power, and it's developing its military forces to do so. And now you move on to the geostrategic stage. And so from a political geostrategic level, I don't want to say I'm a fearmonger, but I'm one of these people that thinks that we're coming to a global conflict here. We're going to have a series of global crises over the course of the next, I think, 10, 15, maybe 20 years. But the ultimate result here is a reestablishment of the world order somehow, because that's what Russia and China want. Ultimately, they want the markets, they want control, they want to be able to dominate. And if they can't do it via their economic and or political power, they'll do it via their military power.
All right. So you put a lot of worms in that can.
Sorry.
That's okay. I mean, that's the point of this, right? Is that, in fact, when we look at this, we can't just look at it through a singular lens. And I heard some criticism of the Americans, for example. Everybody's turning to the Americans to get us out of or to sort of quell what's going on in Europe. And I understand why. But the criticism of Washington is that there is no clearly stated objective from a military perspective. So as you have described all of these interconnected issues, it becomes even more difficult to clearly and succinctly articulate an objective in any one of those areas without affecting the other.
Absolutely. And now I'm going to insert, so we've talked geopolitically, but we haven't talked politically. Mm-hmm. So now let's talk politically. No government, and I mean American, European, but especially Canadian, wants to be caught in a position where they have no choices. Even in the most direst of things that Canada commits to, they don't completely commit. We're going to support Ukraine. What does that mean?
Right. We'll do whatever it takes.
You do whatever it takes.
Mean?
Good. Canadian troops are going to Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the answer, and you can see the reaction to, President Macron's comments, in the last 24 hours have been, so wait a minute, because that can be a red line. Because once you commit NATO troops, doesn't matter who. So there are limits on this. And are those limits actually based upon what the right thing to do is and what that would draw you in geostrategically? Or what is the Canadian population ready to undertake? And that populism, I think it's a real problem. Now, Mark Norman and Tom Lawson were on with Vashi Kapilo here a few days ago, and Mark Norman makes an excellent point. Now, I really like Admiral Norman. I think he's a deep thinker. The right things to do and the way in which you treat security and defense isn't equal with all of the other elements of governance within a country. Yes, education is important. Yes, housing is important. Yes, the economy is important. Yes, healthcare is absolutely important. But none of that exists without the underpinning of defense and security. And at one point in time, these are not partisan issues. They are completely bipartisan issues, and they have to be raised above the platform of that populism. And this is a dangerous slope. To a certain extent, governments don't need to care what the actual citizen or the population thinks, because their responsibilities are on a higher level. Yes, your health care is more, if you're taking dollars from one, you're putting dollars into another. All of those things being true. And yes, we're democracies and we're elected, but at the same time, government needs to understand that you have requirements to do. If the majority of the Canadian population thought that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was the wrong thing, Would we start to vote against it? No, the answer is no. I really don't care what the populism approach is to a specific issue. These things are higher than that. And this comes back to, so what is driving actual Canadian commitments and defense policy and. And it's the same thing in the United States. President Biden, whether it's, and he's catching a lot of flack over Israel right now, doesn't want to be caught in a corner where he can't win the next election based upon a specific issue that he's held firm on. And that puts the value system of each leader in question. And they don't want to be pinned down. And that's conservative. It's been since Harper and before, since Senior Trudeau. I'd say actually Senior Trudeau's the one who maybe stood more on his values, in the course of Canadian history over the last, 40 years than anyone else.
Well, you bring up the Macron statement, suggesting he hasn't ruled out the possibility of putting French boots on the ground, et cetera. And needless to say, that was just incendiary on so many levels. But to your point around the populist idea, that seems to me to fly in the face of that, based on what the general population of France might otherwise want, knowing how quickly and easily they are willing to go out in the streets and protest just about anything. I would think that would drive a lot of people into the streets of Paris. So it sounds to me as though he has sort of taken a tack that you suggest, whether you like it or not, government should actually be considering. And it's interesting to me, and I wonder whether or not this wasn't just done, and of course we're speculating, but to sort of out others and say, listen, to your point, if you're going to do what's right, you better stand up now and do what's right, or at least where do you stand on where do you think what's right, as opposed to what's populist.
Absolutely. Now, I think we can make this as complicated as you want, but my son works in Canadian politics, and he will tell you there's leaders out there that, the staffers behind them are, what did he just say?
Mm-hmm.
As something gets out of his mouth. And
Hair's
there's
on
other,
fire, yeah.
Right. And then there's other ones where this is deliberate. Now, when we think about, heads of state of NATO leading countries, the concept that needs to be firmest in their minds, especially with Russia and China, especially on this return to great power competition, is the concept of deterrence. Putin does not believe that NATO is going to go to war over Ukraine. They don't. So if he takes all of Ukraine, let's just say he defeats the Ukrainian military, even with all of the aid and everything else, NATO's going to stand by and watch. Mm-hmm. So those lines are very clear to him. I think what Macron was saying could be, wait a minute now, if we don't even insert that idea, if the French are ready to do this regardless and draw NATO into a conflict, then tough on NATO, but we're going to draw them into a conflict. There could be a case made that that's a deliberate slip, that he's doing this. So you can see, I don't know which one of it is, right? Our prime minister has said some things off camera and on camera. We've kind of went, is that what you really mean, Mr. Prime Minister? And so I don't know, but it does fly in the face of that populist issue. It's about standing up. Now, it's not surprising out of that individual, because I think he stands for what he stands for, and whether it's been on social issues inside of France or otherwise, he's kind of proven that.
Yeah, indeed. So needless to say, this requires more conversation. It's been great of you to jump in and offer the insight and point out where the clarifications and complications might lie. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me, Dave.
By the way, how's the book doing?
It's doing pretty good. Audiobook sales are up. More people like to listen than read digitally or even in hard copy. And so, yeah, I like that it's spreading. I'm having some of my ideas quoted back to me and then questioned. And I love that idea, too.
Well, that's all about developing leaders, right? So,
absolutely.
Yeah, good. And where do we find the book?
Can find it on Amazon. Just type in Developing Coaching Leaders, or go to my website, www.scottclancy.ca.
Good of you to join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, retired Major General Scott Clancy, RCAF. And among other things, he's also a drummer. We were talking off air after we finished the interview. And it turns out he's a musician, and he gets online and plays with his buddies. He's here in Ontario, I think, and they're in Alaska. So he's got the remote thing down really well. But besides all the expertise that he offered in that interview, He's also the author of Developing Coaching Leaders, so you can check him out on LinkedIn. Scott Clancy, and if you want more details on the book and the offering that he has got, well, there you go. You can find it. scottclancy.ca. All right, that'll do it for us here. It is Now and Next, Story Studio Network's flagship podcast. Got a thought? By all means, offer a comment, a rating, whatever you like. You can find me on social at Dave Trafford. That's Instagram, X, Facebook. Where else am I? Threads, right? And LinkedIn, by the way. And if you're on LinkedIn, we've got the Now and Next LinkedIn newsletter. So it'd be great just if you want to jump in and be part of that community. Love to hear from you. And don't forget, Fridays on the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, and that should be right about where you found this podcast by midday Friday Eastern Time. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend. Thanks for listening. I'm Dave Trafford.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford, and supported by our entire SSN team, including our senior producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler. Jamie Nickerson is our production manager, and our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Also, I'm Erin Trafford, Queen of the Universe.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.